I'm Emily Scott. I am the Guest and Next Steps Director, and I've been here since about 2018, and I'm graduating with my Master's of Divinity this May.
And I'm Sherri Swanson. I am the executive pastor here at Woods Chapel, and I have been a pastor for 18 years, and I have been part of Woods Chapel for almost 30 years.
My name's Abby, and I am the campus pastor of our Raytown campus, and I've been a pastor for about 2 years. Just graduated with my Master's of Divinity in May of 2022. So for me, being a pastor is not necessarily about my gender, but rather just who I am and the gifts that I bring to the position. I do occasionally get people saying, oh my gosh, but it's mostly because of my age, being so young and being a pastor. So it's not necessarily being a female and a pastor. But I have had occasions of, it's usually men, surprisingly, that are kind of like, oh my gosh, a woman pastor. I've never had a woman pastor. So it's been a learning experience. But my greatest moment is one of the first times I was preaching, I wore a dress, and most dresses don't have pockets. And so to figure out where to put the mic pack to preach with an over-the-ear mic.
I would probably say that I might have had a little bit different experiences because I came from the corporate world, and I actually had more feedback in the corporate world from being a woman. And I think that's part of because I kind of grew up at Woods Chapel and it's been my home. So people knew that I was around, and it just kind of made sense to take that next step as becoming a pastor. So I really haven't had that. It's brought me joy and it's brought me meaning. Now, don't get me wrong. There's definitely some difficult situations that we've had. And being as an executive pastor, you kind of work on the business side of the church that you don't think about that often. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely been joy in meeting among the difficult times as well.
Yeah, I kind of identify with both of that it's great joy, and then there are some times, and especially with your comment about it being young and a woman, I really identify with that because before I started working here, what I did was I did pulpit fill. So I'd kind of go to churches where a pastor was out, and I can't tell you how many times I'd walk into a church and they'd be like, oh, are you here to play the piano or the organ? Because for so many of them, it just was like, it was especially a young woman coming in there like, oh, really? You're here to present the message and to do the sermon today? And it was really cool to kind of see that shock and then kind of see that, like you said, kind of like that learning opportunity together as I was learning if ministry was really kind of my path. And we were getting to do that with these different congregations was really kind of a cool experience starting off on my ministry journey.
One thing that I absolutely love about the Methodist denomination is that we do ordain women, and women in ministry are encouraged. And that is something that I've held very close to my heart. It's interesting to think about what the Bible has to say about this, because there are a few churches out there and denominations that focus just on that passage. And that's kind of unfortunate as far as I'm concerned. What I think is, though, if you look at the Bible and you look at how many examples there are of women leading in the Bible, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, Deborah was a judge, and you look at Phoebe, who was a deacon. There is
Priscilla, Lydia, Mary Magdalene, all of these people.
Absolutely. I mean, the two biggest evangelists were when they went to the tomb and said, Jesus has risen. I mean, look at that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Women got to be the first pronouncers of the resurrection, so that was awesome.
Absolutely.
I remember when I was first coming into ministry that even though I grew up Methodist and I knew the support was behind, I also knew all of those other denominations that didn't support. And so that made me kind of really think about, was this really a call from God? Were we, going off course? But knowing that I had all that support within my own denomination gave me that go-ahead to really pursue this call.
So I think a lot of times when one of us has the opportunity to preach and then we share that video on social media or whatever it is, a lot of times we end up getting questions or comments saying, how do we respond to the 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12 verse that says that women should not be preaching or teaching and that they should be silent? I think that verse gets thrown around quite a bit.
Yes.
But for me, when I look at that verse and when people kind of ask me my opinion on how I approach that verse as a women pastor, I have to remind myself even that, this is one verse in this entire Bible. of all the teachings that Paul and Jesus has that tell us to go out and make disciples and to make Christ known, and if one of the passions and skills that Christ has given me is to speak, I feel like that is the gifts that I have to be able to share. And also looking at it, the fact that when Paul and the other writers of the New Testament were writing this, they were writing it to very specific groups of people.
Absolutely.
So to then make that a blanket statement for everyone, I think really just takes away so much power that Christ has put within everyone, man, woman, anyone has so much power and so much passion and so much purpose that we can share into the world.
Yep. And I think what adds to that is that God gifted everybody with wonderful gifts to impact the world all around us. And that if you take out all the females, that's less people to make this world more loving and kind and generous. And so I don't think that's God's plan.
Well, I would agree. I would even think that if you really look at it, if we look at the way that Jesus lived and what we're aspiring to do, he did not diminish women. He elevated women just as much as men.
Yeah, so I think it's really important when we look at any scripture, not just this Timothy verse, but any verse, being able to look at the whole context of it and say, how do we apply this to our lives, the whole breadth of the scripture, not going line by line and reading it so literal, but how can we make it alive in our lives?
Yes, what it meant then, but also what it now means to us today.
So ministry can be really hard sometimes and can be quite a challenge. And if I had to pick, probably my most challenging time is when I do funerals for friends or loved ones.
Yes.
And the one that was probably the hardest was when I did the service for my father-in-law. You know, you have to pull it together for that hour. And my friend Joyce Steincross always said, you know, Sherri, you can cry a lot afterwards, but you got to pull it together for this hour. And it is hard because you're standing in front of people. And of course, we show emotion and there are tears, but we also have to get that message across. And that's probably the most challenging time that I've had.
That's one thing, too, about, you know, women pastors sometimes is they're like, oh, you're too emotional. But I think that authenticity of being able to show that emotion is very rewarding to everybody in ministry. But in my case, a difficult time was that I became a pastor during a global pandemic, and I put a lot of high standards on my own life and how I want to show up in the world, but also in ministry. And so that was a very difficult time, just to know that we as a world were going under these really difficult times, but also then to lead people through that time was going through that own grief of, you know, I have to change to adapt to our circumstances and lead others through that time of grief and change meant that I first had to become resilient myself, to take care of myself so that I could take care of others during a very difficult time.
Yeah. I think in ministry, like creating those like boundaries, those healthy boundaries, because we want to care for people, but we also ultimately have to be caring of ourselves so that we have enough in our reserves to pour out onto others. And I think for me, one of the most challenging times was right when I was deciding if ministry was the path for me, just for some like background issues and things in our past of my husband and I at the time when we were still dating. He kind of came from a background where me being a woman wanting to go into ministry was not accepted. And so we were just getting a lot of comments from outside sources and from people that we really respected saying that this was not going to be good for our family and that I was going to be doing harm to our family.
Wow.
And so that was something really big we had to work through of, you know, we're getting these messages from people that we love and respect, but this is truly a calling that I feel that's been put on my life. And I still feel like some of that baggage or comments, whatever it is, you know, when we transition into becoming parents and then feeling like, am I being a good enough mother? Am I being a good enough wife? Like, what is my role? How do I balance being a pastor and a mother? And I think some of those comments and just being sure and like you said, being resilient in myself and that this is truly something that I feel that God has called me to. So God will equip me to be the best mother, the best pastor, the best wife that I am able to be because I'm doing it all for the glory of God.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I was going to say that so many times We don't just get it's 5 o'clock, we're going home.
Mm-hmm. No.
We get to take off that pastor hat and be able to not think about the people that we care for, because there is so much emotion and so much that we pour into this that you do bring it home, whether you want to or not.
Because it's not just a job. It's really, we are building relationships each and every day as we care for one another, but also, we are in the midst of, receiving people's stories and being a part of the best times and the worst times of people's lives. So they're trying to figure out how to love God and neighbor. And, that's rewarding, but it also, that emotional labor
is heavy.
It's heavy.
Very heavy.
But an honor.
My gosh.
To get to be with people in those moments as well.
So today is International Women's Day. And so we just talked about how we get to be part of these really good times and bad times, and how we've had to have resilience in ministry. So who's maybe somebody or a group of people that have inspired you in ministry?
I've been very blessed that I have a lot of role models of faith just like in my family that I've looked up to, but probably like in a professional sense, it would honestly be you, Sherri, and then a minister that I had growing up, Mandy Yates, because for me, I didn't even know until I was older that like being a woman in ministry was even like could be controversial, because I had Mandy growing up who just owned it and she rocked it. And I thought that was just a profession you could have. And then learning from you and just women who are just so confident in their roles and are killing it in their ministry roles. It's just really encouraging to see.
Wow.
And I would have to say, you've been my supervisor at times while I've worked here, and just to get to work with you and have your ministry insight has been very meaningful to me as well. But I would have to say there's many people in my own life. I remember when I first was going through the process of starting the candidacy process, Reverend Karen Hayden, she likes to say something about thinking about going into ministry. And she was one of the very first woman pastors that I ever met. And so she was an inspiration, just being a new mom at the time, and just what she was doing at a larger level. And then coming here to Woods Chapel, and we had a lead pastor that was a woman at a time, and then an executive pastor. And so it was just very meaningful to have those role models.
Well, and I would say that over my years, I have just been absolutely blessed to be surrounded by people who've had more experience than me, and then maybe people that have come in with less experience in the beginning, but the perspective of some of the younger generation that you all have bring to the table is just incredible. And but if I have to go back and think of the person that probably influenced me the most and just really helped me, was my mom. And it really wasn't about going into ministry because she had passed, but the most interesting part is how she lived her life. And she lived her life closer to the walk of Jesus than anybody that I could honestly say. And she truly walked with grace and joy and such a life of generosity. And I just always had inspired to be more like my mom.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I've learned even more from you ladies than I even knew before. And I'm just so honored to get to serve with you.
Absolutely. I love working with you all and coming to work every day to see you all and to serve right alongside you.
And so I would say, here's to the women here and here's to all the women out there.